Today's episode is sponsored by the new Refrigeration differential pressure monitor from Westermeyer Industries. When the filter element of your coalescing oil separator is contaminated, it can hurt your system's performance and efficiency. But how do you know when it's time to replace the filter? Wait too long to service the filter, and you could end up with nasty filter blowout. But replacing too often can be a waste of time and money. The answer is installing a differential pressure monitor. The new Refrigeration RDP-01 differential pressure monitor is available now with Westermeyer Industries. To find out more, email sales@westermeyerind.com. Once again, that's sales@westermeyerind.com. Look for the new pressure differential monitor, available now.
Hi guys, welcome to the Advanced Refrigeration podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Compass. I wanted to take a quick minute to talk about one of our sponsors that make this podcast possible, and that's Parker Sporlan and the Catch-All Filter Dryer. Do you know what can reduce system efficiencies and reliability within your refrigeration system? If you answered contamination, you are correct. Sporlan Catch-All dryers have been around since 1947 and have been perfected over the years to capture water, acid, solids, debris, including sludges and varnishes. For best practices, change the Catch-All filter dryer if any of the following occurs. Initial system install, when a system is open for service or repair, when excessive pressure drop of 5 psi across the filter dryer, when the See All sight glass indicates water is present, when doing a T1-1 acid test kit says there's acid present, during a compressor burnout cleanup, and following a successful burnout cleanup. To find out more information, by downloading Bulletin 40-10 from Sporlan.com with all the Catch-All filter dryer information. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the episode.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Advanced Refrigeration Podcast. You're here with your hosts, Brett Wetzel and Kevin Compass. How's your week going so far, man?
Not too bad. Just running around doing all these little mini OGP startups that we have like 90 to do in like the next like 3 months. So I'm just jumping from roof to roof, basically freezing my ass off all week long in this beautiful, shitbox weather we have up here in Chicago, where it goes from 60 to 18 degrees in less than 12 hours.
You know, you sent me a picture and you were like, you said it was 18 degrees up there.
Yeah. I'm up there heating refrigerant tanks up that we left on the roof when it was 60. And, and now it's 18, trying to get it to go into a unit, a medium temp unit. So I'm up there heating them over the torch, trying to, get a little bit more gas in there so I don't have to go back down. But yeah, all these lovely OGP units that are going in and all these places now that seem to be on the opposite side of the roof hatch from everything else. So it's like a mile-long walk for everything.
At least there's no snow yet, though, right?
No, we just got that wonderful white roof ice. That wonderful ice where you're just walking and all of a sudden you see your feet at the same level as your head.
Yeah, I've busted my ass a bunch of times on those.
I mean, you people don't even know what ice is now.
Yeah, we had some ice. It's been getting down where I think our low has been like 47.
I hate you. That's t-shirt weather still.
Yeah. I'm getting to be a pansy though. Like I was like usually I have the heat at like 70 and I came up in the front office to record tonight and I was like, damn, I'm freaking cold. So I throw on a sweatshirt, I kick on the heat, and I'm like, man, I'm getting old. That's what it is.
70. That's how you know you're doing good, when you can heat the house with 70. 66 in this house.
Yeah, I'm making up for lost time. So when I was when I lived back in Pennsylvania, I lived in a back room, and it would ever get I could get it 10 degrees higher than whatever the ambient was. So if it'd be like 0 degrees outside in PA, I can get it up to about 10 degrees, a little space heater sitting on the end of the bed next to the sewing machine just to keep it warm in there. I'd bring girls over and try to figure out what to do. And I was like, throwing their clothes underneath the bed, like underneath the covers. And they're like, what are you doing that for? I was like, don't worry about it. You'll appreciate it in the morning. I promise.
Jesus Christ.
So
all right, tonight we're going to talk about Enviro-Guard. Enviro-Guard and specifically critical charge floating head racks. So we're going to go over a couple of them. We're going to briefly touch on Enviro-Guard 1 just because of the theories behind it. I mean, if you're seeing Enviro-Guard 1, I am going to be, I doubt the SPR valve still works. So, I mean, it's probably been upgraded, but we're going to go over the Enviro-Guard setup, and then the probably end up being 2 podcasts. And I also want to go over the SR floating racks at Costco because there's a ton of those out there and a lot of guys don't understand how they work. And then maybe we'll touch on the second part on the equalizer racks on how those ones actually work. It's a little bit different, but we're going to start with Enviro-Guard, and we're going to start with Enviro-Guard 1. So the whole premise and theory behind this was with Enviro-Guard is, I believe some dude in Michigan made this. I'm not for sure. He had the original design. So Enviro-Guard is a floating head pressure critically charged rack. So this is where when floating head pressure first started coming around was when the Enviro-Guard was coming out. So the whole theory behind this is we no longer have a receiver. So we're going to go over a couple terms now. We're going to go over surge tank, flash tank. I've heard it called multiple things. So it's a vessel. It's no longer a receiver. So it no longer has an in and out. So you can't think of the Enviro-Guard as a receiver. It's a critically charged system. So what we do by eliminating the receiver is we reduce the charge. The biggest advantage to Enviro-Guard is the charge reduction. So instead of an extra 300 to 400 pounds for a receiver, now we have a critically charged rack that you lose 50, 60 pounds of gas. You now have a case running warm, and you're out there when you lost 50 pounds of gas instead of losing 300 pounds of gas before you get an alarm and you're out there looking for it. The other benefit to this is now we can bank on ambient subcooling. Now, ambient subcooling meaning we can get the liquid line down, within like 2 to 3 degrees of ambient on a properly running Enviro-Guard rack. And we can subcool the living shit out of the refrigerant. So we gain all that efficiency by subcooling it. And at the same time, we can float our head pressure down to almost nothing, where you would normally not be able to do this because you need that delta P across the TXV with, subcooling numbers in maybe 2 to 5 degrees on a normal running rack. With an Enviro-Guard, you may have 50 or 60 degrees of subcooling, depending on what the ambient is and how low you go with your settings. So that subcooling makes up for that loss of delta P across the valve. So if you don't have that 100 pounds or 80 pounds across the TXV, that massive amount of subcooling you have is going to make up for it.
So the newer Enviro-Guards, they typically try to maintain 12 to 16, right? Depending on customer set points. What are the Enviro-Guard ones? What was the subcooling set for on that one?
So the Enviro-Guard ones, I'm not ultimately familiar. I'm looking at it right now, but so the Enviro-Guard ones were not a true subcooling. So it was ambient subcooling. That's where you're going to hear this term. You're going to hear drop leg subcooling, and you're going to hear us talk about ambient subcooling. So Enviro-Guard 1, to answer your question, I'm going to go into this explanation, then we'll answer it. So Enviro-Guard 1, you have a device, which they call an SPR valve. This is what Tyler invented. So it is basically a valve that is going to feed liquid out of the condenser drop leg into the vessel / receiver. So the way it did this was by measuring ambient subcooling. So what they did is this SPR valve came off. So off the drop leg, you had a 5/8 line that came off, and it went to this SPR valve. This SPR valve was sensing drop leg pressure. And then it had a bulb and a cap tube that went all the way up to the roof underneath the condenser. And you would fill it halfway with liquid refrigerant. And what you were doing was you were trying to get the liquid refrigerant in that bulb cap tube to that would equal the outside air. So whatever the outside, say it was 75 degrees outside, it would equal the pressure of 75 degrees or whatever that refrigerant was, and that would be your bulb pressure. So, and then it was looking at your drop leg pressure. So as your drop leg pressure increased, okay, now you have all this subcooling. So what would happen is as it increased, it would allow that valve to push open and refrigerant would feed into the receiver / vessel. It would feed into the receiver. As your subcooling, ambient subcooling came down, as your pressure came down, now that bulb pressure would power that drop leg pressure and it would shut the valve. And then refrigerant would meter out of the tank, but via a cap tube. So there was a cap tube on the liquid out, what would normally be your liquid out. There's a cap tube constantly feeding refrigerant out of the bottom of this tank. So it's constantly sitting there draining refrigerant back into the system, into the suction. And then as it builds up pressure again, your ambient subcooling is increasing and it's going to overpower the bulb and it's going to allow it in there. Now, whatever you set this for is what your target was. I think it was like 10 to 12 degrees was the approach on there. I mean, it varies. I mean, whatever you set that SPR valve for. See, Tyler has all kinds of charts on how to set the valve. We're not going to go too much into that because if you still have that, cut it out. I mean, with modern day controls, I mean, there's no reason to use the mechanical valve for that. And we're going to go over it in a second of why we don't use it. So in the beginning, there was a lot of negativity about the Enviro-Guard setup because for this very reason, if you lost condenser fan motors or you had a dirty condenser, what would happen is now your ambient subcooling is faked out. So that bulb pressure is 95 degrees outside. That bulb pressure is reading 95 degree, saturation temperature into pressure. Well, say your condenser's plugged and you're reading you're running a saturation of 120. Okay, now it's going to think you have a massive amount of subcooling, so it's going to open that valve. That valve's going to open up because the drop leg pressure is higher than the bulb pressure, and it's going to feed all the liquid into the vessel / receiver. So you're going to get to a call, and all your gas and liquid, or all your liquid's stuck in a receiver, and you have cases running warm. So guys would fret about this and say it takes forever to pump it all out. So on every Enviro-Guard, so they have this 1/2 inch line coming off the bottom, 1/2 inch or 5/8 going to the SPR valve. So there was a T there, and there was another ball valve on there, and it would go into the same tank, and that was a fast fill. So if you ever had to drain refrigerant out in a hurry, you could bypass the SPR valve. Now on the other side of that, you had a ball valve on your main liquid ball valve on your drop leg. You could close that ball valve, and there was another 5/8 ball valve on the other side of that ball valve that you were able to drain the tank out with. So there was a fast drain on the tank. So what you would do is you'd back up all that gas in the condenser, and you would suck that tank out with that 5/8 line real quick. So that was the drawback to this. A dirty condenser, anything that falsely affected the condenser pressure made your ambient subcooling faked out, because this SPR valve is a mechanical valve. It's a dumb valve. It doesn't know what the actual subcooling is. It's going off ambient subcooling. It's not outdoor subcooling, or a drop leg subcooling, it's ambient subcooling. So if you had a dirty condenser, you actually have no subcooling, but the rack thinks or the SPR valve thinks you do because it's of ambient subcooling.
Or if the SPR bulb actually lost its charge. I've seen that already, where basically you get up there And there's no liquid refrigerant in there whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, half the time it was a 3/8 or quarter-inch tube. You're going up like 10, 15 feet. I mean, 20 feet. I mean, it's pretty hard to keep a length of ACR, hard copper from, dancing when it's like that. The other thing was with that is that SPR valve leaked a lot. I mean, it was an alco valve. It was specially made for that. You're not getting a rebuild for it. You're not getting a new one. You pretty much got to cut it out. And then the other part of this was I want to go over the drain system. So the way they did the drain is on the actual receiver / vessel, you had a drain tube that came out. It was 3/8, went up to a cap tube or a solenoid, then to a cap tube. And then they wrapped around the discharge line post oil separator. They wrapped the discharge line with copper, probably like 10 or 12 wraps. So what they were doing that, they were superheating that refrigerant and putting it in the suction, so they weren't just dumping straight liquid in the suction all the time.
Hey Kev, hold on. I'm gonna try to switch internet. I don't know what's gonna happen. Apparently my signal is telling me it's screwed up. Hey guys, I want to take a break and talk about Westermeyer, one of our other sponsors. Today's episode is sponsored by Westermeyer Industries, the leader in oil management and pressure vessels for the commercial refrigeration industry. All right. See if we can just continue. I gotta fix something on my end.
Okay, so now the whole thing with charging an Enviro-Guard rack, where this whole thing comes in, is you don't want a receiver level in the winter time. You want to run when it's below 70 degrees. You should have no receiver level. Basically, when you're like 80 to 90 degrees, you should have 20% refrigerant level. Tank says. I want to have a little bit of refrigerant in there, a little bit more. I run them with a little bit more refrigerant there because I want to basically play with my subcooling numbers a little bit. But in the middle of wintertime, you should have a clear sight glass and you should have a good subcooling number. That is a properly charged Enviro-Guard. They say within 2 to 3 degrees of ambient temperature is a properly charged Enviro-Guard. If you have, if you're 10 degrees from ambient temperature on a clean condenser with all the motors running, you're probably a little bit shy on gas. You probably need a little bit more refrigerant in there. Now, that's your drop leg temp. If you're if you walk up to it in the summertime and you just look at the refrigerant level and it's at 0 and the sight glass is clear, I mean, you're probably not that low. I mean, you may be a little bit. The biggest thing is a lot of these Enviro-Guards, especially 1 and 2, you'll find them locked off. You'll walk up to them and these guys say they don't work. They have the SPR tank valved off and they're running like a critically charged rack. When you run it like a critically charged rack, the biggest issue is now you have nowhere for that refrigerant to go. So now you may put 25 extra pounds of gas in there and you're having head pressure issues now. And you're burning through tons of energy because you now have the tank valved off and you're just running it as a clear sight glass. So you may lose 25, 30 pounds and you're getting a call for a case running warm. But at the same time, when you get this swing in temperature, when it goes from like 80 degrees outside down to 50 or 40, that rack's now low on gas. It doesn't have enough refrigerant in it. So you end up adding like 50 to 100 pounds of gas to make up for that. Now you're looking for a leak. Now you have a Versailles entry. And this whole thing, just because you aren't setting it up properly. That's on Enviro-Guard 1. Now, all these problems a lot of these guys say come from Enviro-Guard 1. Now we're going to transition into Enviro-Guard 2. So Enviro-Guard 2 came out to help with the issues with 1. So what Enviro-Guard 2 did is it started to introduce controls into this. CPC, Danfoss, Novar, Microthermal, whoever. So what Enviro-Guard 2 is, they put a normally open solenoid on, or sorry, normally closed solenoid, depending. Some of them were normally open, some were normally closed, in front of the SPR valve. Now, what they did with this was to help with the head pressure issue. So what they would do is they would control this solenoid. All the fans had to be on. The last fan had to be on for this solenoid to energize and allow the SPR valve to dump. So meaning, unless it was you were meeting your head pressure set point and you were above it, you couldn't dump. So that means the condenser was fully flooded. The other thing it did is if you had a power outage, it didn't allow the SPR valve to dump all the refrigerant in the receiver. So a lot of times at these Enviro-Guard 1 racks, when they would lose power, you would end up dumping a bunch of refrigerant in the receiver and you couldn't get it out. So that's where it became an issue. So this solenoid took over that and it kept that from happening. And they also allowed it a little bit more control. So Enviro-Guard, the charging was the same. The adjustments on the SPR valve were the same. You still followed the same chart and set it up the same way. You still had the bulb on the roof and everything else. Now, we're going to transfer into Enviro-Guard 3. So this is where we're going to spend the most of the amount of time because you're going to see most of these left. Hey, Brett, I went over Enviro-Guard 2 just real quick.
You're fine.
Yeah. So we're going to go into Enviro-Guard 3. This is where the meat and potatoes is. This is where pretty much everything you're going to see now. And this is where you end up with the adaptation of the SR racks the Zero Zone has and the ones that Hill Phoenix also made. So if you guys don't know, Hill Phoenix obviously owns Tyler, so they also own the Enviro-Guard. So they also have their own. They have their version of the Enviro-Guard, which they slap their name on. So other people like Kaiser, Warren, Husband, they all have their version. They all have a different name. So Enviro-Guard 3. This is where we bring in full computer control and we ditch the SPR valve. We ditch ambient subcooling, and now we're going for straight drop leg subcooling. This is where the Enviro-Guard takes off and becomes super efficient. So now we're no longer running off of the SPR valve. So now we eliminate the problems with the dirty condensers, fan motors out, power loss. We eliminate all those. So now we're running off of a solenoid on a drop leg. Evidently, it's still called the SPR valve. So you'll still see it called the SPR valve, but it's no longer a mechanical SPR valve. It is a solenoid. So what they're doing at this solenoid is they have a transducer on the drop leg. They have a temp sensor on the drop leg. So they are measuring drop leg subcooling. And they are taking that and they are taking an account for it. And they are calculating it out with a computer. It's reading a subcooling value. And it's operating the solenoid. Now, this is where it gets kind of tricky, and some people agree and some people disagree on this. Depending on how far the condenser is above the rack, you may have to offset the transducer for the static loss. Now, if it's less than 10 to 15 feet, I do not offset the transducer. I'll check it and see what my static is. But here's the thing, you have static when you're sitting, as long as your drop leg transducer is actually reading what your drop leg pressure is. If you check it and it's good, I don't mess with it. If it's more than 15 feet, I'll offset it. Because obviously the weight of the refrigerant is going to add pressure to your drop leg. It can, depending on how high it is and how dramatic it is. But that's on a static system. We're a dynamic system. We have dynamic flow and we're flowing. So, I mean, what do you think, Brett? I mean, I don't ever offset them that much.
No, maybe 2 to 3 psi. I mean, it depends, right? What's their stance on? Because I'm asking because I don't know, on mounting the transducer up by the condenser so you don't have to have an effect for that static pressure.
So obviously Tyler didn't do that, but a lot of the SR racks do, like the Costco style. They started doing that a lot. I mean, to be honest, I like it on an Enviro-Guard. I would think it would be better, but I don't think. I think that the difference would be minimal. I mean, on an average rack room, I'm not talking one that's 25, 30 feet up. If you're 15 feet, 10 feet, I mean, you're not going to gain much static pressure off that.
Yeah, all the Costco's that I was used to is basically we're on a mezzanine, and then the condenser was almost directly above it, so it wasn't a real long pipe run at all.
Yeah, you're talking maybe 12 feet, maybe, if even that.
Unless the steel. Oh.
Yeah. So as we do this, now we're looking at droplet subcooling. So the way that this was set up, and I'll give you guys the exact numbers off the Enviro-Guard manual, just so I'm not lying, and then we'll go over how I set them up, because I do something a lot different. So first, we're going to go over the head pressure settings. So on the Enviro-Guard head pressure settings, I mean, you're going to see super low pressures. I mean, a lot of these guys, get kind of iffy about this. So with medium temp 404, your low temp for electric defrost, your head pressure setting is 85 pounds. So for medium temp electric defrost, you're 125 pounds. So we're getting extremely low. With hot gas defrost for 404, you're looking at 114 pounds. And then for medium temp, 125 still. So you're looking like 45 degree condensing for low temp. It may be even lower than that. I don't have a PT chart in front of me. I don't know why they give it in pressure, but so you're slamming your head down to nothing. So you're, sub low delta P's. Like this is what they want. Now, the way that they set this up is they run a 14 degree subcooling number is what they're trying to maintain. So they're trying to maintain 14 degrees of subcooling, but the SPR valve has to meet a certain condition before it starts to dump. So the way that Tyler has you set it up is the last fan has to be running. So say you had a 12 fan or a 10 fan condenser. So really in the program, it would be 10 or 11 fans. Sometimes you make a fake fan. You have to be at head pressure setting. So if your head pressure setting is 125, you have to be above 125 for that SPR valve to meet the first condition. The second condition would be you have to be above your subcooling number. So once you're above head pressure setting and above your subcooling number, you're going to dump into the tank. If you're below head pressure setting or below the subcooling number, you're not going to dump into the tank. So it's going to keep stacking gas in there and keep flooding the condenser 100% until it gets that down. Like I said before, now we're not looking at ambient subcooling, we're looking at droplet subcooling. You still want to look at ambient subcooling because it tells you how well you're doing with your condenser and how your gas charge is doing. On a properly working Enviro-Guard, you should be within 2 to 3 degrees of outside air.
What's the TD tip so the guys know what they're looking for?
So typically it's 10 degrees for the low temp, 15 degrees for medium temp. That's what all the condensers are sized for. Now, it gets different with this because you also got to remember an Enviro-Guard condenser is not 3/8 tubing. Typically, it's 1/2 inch. So your condenser is technically like your receiver. So you got to look at that. So most Enviro-Guard condensers were massive. Like they had massive 1/2 inch tubes instead of 3/8 tubes. So that's one thing to consider because we had this happen to us is somebody quoted a condenser change out and didn't realize that it had 1/2 inch tubes and it was an Enviro-Guard and it was sized a lot differently. You really need to talk to the condenser manufacturer about that before you just go throwing one all willy-nilly. And whatever you do, do not throw a microchannel on it.
Because you're not going to get shit for subcooling.
We have a store up here. In my last shop, they threw a microchannel on there, and they they threw a 12 fan microchannel on there, and it was a disaster. Nonstop head pressure issues because the SPRs couldn't dump fast enough, and they basically the subcooling would just, they had no VFDs, so the subcooling would just bang on and off all over the place, because whenever a bank would come on, especially when it's cold, that aluminum coil cools down so quick. So you would go from no subcooling to like 30 degrees in like less than like a minute.
And guys,
and it would just dump.
Sorry. What I was going to say is don't be surprised if your drop leg in the wintertime is all iced up. It's going to freak you out the first time you see it. But yeah, because I mean, like there's certain stores like Costco's. I mean, I had a rack that was 507. Their set point was 99 psi, and basically, in the middle of wintertime up in New England, it gets pretty damn cold. So, your drop leg, all your lines going to your solenoids are all iced up, and you think there's something wrong.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, these head pressure settings, these settings work. So if you see something that low, a lot of guys see something that low and they just instantly freak out and think it's not going to work. It's not going to work. We did a refrigerant conversion on a store that's literally like 10 minutes from my house. And we were there and we converted from 22 to 407. We set every valve. And then 2 days after the retrofit, I had my version of Enviro-Guard running, which we'll go over that. We hit minus 15 for 4 days straight. Like it was just miserable. This rack it was a 120 horsepower rack. It was running with 15 horse on one compressor. It never cycled. It didn't bring another compressor on. It was running no fan motors. It hadn't cycled the condenser fan motor in like a day and a half. And the thing just ran. The liquid temp was like 18 to 20 degrees on a medium temp rack.
Wow. So I've never done insulation on one. Do you have to insulate the liquid line with a heavier, thicker insulation?
So they call for that is a customer thing, but all liquid lines with Enviro-Guard need to be insulated. So that's a customer thing, and it really depends on them. So at least half-inch insulation on liquid lines is, that's pretty standard on every install I see now. Everything is insulated. But yeah, they required all the lines to be insulated. You also wanted your drop leg to be insulated coming off the roof. So you want it to be insulated all the way down to the rack. So you don't want to lose any of that subcooling, especially in the motor room.
I got to get Michael Squires. Michael Squires has a bunch of really good pictures of the actual, the racks running stupid subcooling where everything's iced up and frosted up. Mike, if you're listening, send those over to me.
Yeah. So, you could have a boatload of subcooling, especially running the fans in the middle of the winter. The other thing that was nice about this was you weren't banging the fans on all winter long. Because, a lot of them hit a point where they were pretty steady, especially if you were in like a ambient where it's like 30, 40 degrees. You hit a point where you were pretty steady and you'd be running like 3 or 4 banks of fans. So this is where it becomes like that struggle. So it's a lot cheaper to run a 1.5 horse fan motor than it is to run a 20 horse compressor. So, that boatload of subcooling made those compressors larger. So where you may need 4 compressors to run, now you're doing the work with 4 compressors with 2 compressors. So that boatload of subcooling made those compressors more efficient. You were able to do more work because you have that colder liquid. That liquid's going a lot farther in those evaporators. And your compression ratio is like nothing. So, you're running a rack where this is where an Enviro-Guard in a cold application, so I'm in Chicago 4 months out of the year. It's shitty here and it's hot. Miserable, not like that hell that Brett lives in. But then the rest of the time we spend it in this frozen hell up here. So that's where like Enviro-Guard does great. Like up north, Enviro-Guard does great, and there's a lot of them up here. In Texas, there's really no point in putting Enviro-Guard in except for the reduced refrigerant charge. That's it. You're not going to save the energy you would on a normal rack like that. Up here, up north, you're going to save a ton, and you're going to reduce your refrigerant charge if it's set up properly. Now, let's go into the actual charging of this. So if you're above 70 degrees, you need to have 20 to 25% in the receiver. Now, when you walk up to an Enviro-Guard, I do this all the time because this happens at least once a year. We have a new guy or an apprentice overcharge the living shit out of an Enviro-Guard rack because they walk up to the rack, they got a case running warm or whatnot. They look at the receiver gauge. Oh no, the receiver gauge is 0. I'm low on gas. So they just start chalking gas in this thing. And it's like, oh no, the refrigerant level finally came up. I put 200 pounds in. Oh no. Somebody finally notices, and it's an Enviro-Guard rack. So this is with any rack. You've never been there. You don't know what it is. Look around, look at it, look for the Enviro-Guard signs. But even Zero Zone, and like I said, Hill Phoenix has these. So I always trace out my piping when I'm looking at something new. If I've never been to a store before and I've never been in the rack room and I'm there for something more than a fan motor out, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to look around. I'm going to look for the exits in case I blow something up, the fire extinguisher, and I'm going to look at the rack and trace out the piping. When I'm tracing out the piping, I'm looking at where my drop leg comes down, where it hits the receiver, to make sure that I don't have an Enviro-Guard rack or some kind of critically charged rack, because there's nothing worse than trying to explain to a customer why you just bill it for 300 pounds of gas they don't need, and it's a good way to lose accounts.
I don't think I've ever had anyone overcharge.
Oh, it happens at least once or twice a year up here. Like, especially with the apprentices, they see the receiver level and they freak out and they think they're low on gas. And so, I mean, that's what's one thing. I mean, if you're not above 70 degrees, you really shouldn't have much of a receiver level. But above 70, you should have 20% in there. Now, if you're below 70, there's a specific charging instructions. So you want to have a specific subcooling. So when you're charging, you want to have the SPR valve locked off, and you want the saturated temperature set 35 degrees above the outside air. So if it's 0 out, set it 35 degrees above the ambient temperature. Close off the SPR dump line, and you're going to add charge until your subcooling is about 30 degrees. So, I mean, that's good to about 30 degrees outside. You could do it that way. If it's at 0, clear to glass, you're done. If it's at minus 10, clear to glass, you're done. I mean, you only need to have a clear glass at that lowest ambient.
Now, are the fans going to continue to be on if you're undercharged because it's trying to achieve that subcooling? Or if it's maintaining the set point of the actual pressure, would the condenser fans shut off?
So usually when you're low on charge, your fans start shutting off because you can't actively flood that condenser. So you start losing that flooding charge, and then you start losing load because you no longer have that full column going to those cases, and then you start spiraling out of control. You start losing that efficiency, and you start losing that horsepower boost, and then you start cycling, and then really the whole rack starts running like shit. So that's why on there you want to make sure it's charged right, and that's why locking them off is a terrible idea, because you lock off that SPR valve, and you run it like a critically charged rack, which I see all over the place up here. There is many independents all over like that. There's all kinds of national accounts like that. They don't know they're like that because these guys say that the Enviro-Guard doesn't work because they had problems with the Enviro-Guard 1 and they're sour about it. So they lock it off. They run it like a critically charged rack, and then when it's 80 degrees outside, it has enough gas in it. But when it's 20 degrees outside, now it's low on gas.
Yeah, and like the newer Enviro-Guards, they have so much better control as far as trying to achieve set point and trying to achieve subcooling.
Yeah, so now with the way that Tyler does it, I don't per se like the way they do it. I mean, they have an entire setup sheet for an RMCC, which, just smash it with a hammer if you still have it. I mean, those things are never going to die. Danfoss, Microthermal, and Comtrol, and an E2. So they have this entire setup guide. That's how old this is. They have this entire setup guide with this. Now, you could follow it, and you could go through their stuff and the way they set it up. I, per se, like to do mine a little differently. I do my own version of Enviro-Guard with a floating set point. So what I do is I take the subcooling set point and I float it. So mine gets a little more complicated. I use in CPC, I use a flexible combiner. So what I'm doing is, as the outside air temperature increases, I'm changing my subcooling targets. So when it's below 50, my subcooling target's 15 degrees. I'm trying to maintain 15 degrees of subcooling. So I'm trying to, gain all that extra refrigerant in that condenser when it's, in the fall and winter. When I get above 50 degrees, when I get to 60-ish, what I do is I float the set point up. I start raising it from 14 down to 9 or 8 degrees. So this is where the other side of Enviro-Guard is an issue. In the middle of summer, if you're running a 14-degree subcooling on the drop leg, you're stacking that gas in there to get that 14 degrees. Okay, you cannot gain subcooling in the middle of summer. It's no longer free, so you're raising that head pressure to get it. So all you're doing is raising that compression ratio. So you're not saving as much energy and you're driving up your head pressure. So what I do is I lower that subcooling number down to a bare minimum where I need it. And I'm reducing the head pressure, and I'm reducing the refrigerant charge, and I'm reducing the
Energy
pressure in the condenser. So yeah, I'm reducing the energy consumption basically. So I float my set point. So I write an algorithm inside of the flexible combiner that varies the set point within a specific range. Now, it runs one range when it's, a certain outside air temp, and it runs another range when it's another outside air temp. And that becomes my subcooling number. And then I'm also, running my SPR valve off that same screen. And then I do it two other ways. So I'm trying to maintain the vessel at a certain pressure, and I ditch the cap tube and I put a TXV on it. So what I'm doing with the TXV is I'm able to pump out the tank faster and shut it off when need to. And then I could pressurize the tank if I need it with a solenoid off a discharge. I could pulse it and pressurize the tank to keep it at a certain pressure, like 20, 30 pounds above suction pressure, so that way the TXV feeds out.
So were you doing this at Independence?
Yeah. So
Okay.
Right now there's 14 independents in Chicago running it. Zero issues. We had no issues with this thing with gas getting stuck in it. They pump out quickly. The KW usage was great on them. I mean, we had zero issues. The head pressure issues all went away. And it ran great. We have no issues with it.
I was just asking because I know how most national chains, they're very particular on the way they're programmed. So if you try to, tell a second party programming company that this is the way it should be done, they're going to go tell you to go pound sand. That's not the way. We have 30 other stores in the area, Yeah,
and all 30 stores run like shit.
Come on.
Yeah. And then this is very similar to how when we start getting into the SR racks and we talk about the Costco style racks, it's very similar to that. Theirs goes a little bit more in depth with it because they have a little bit more control the way they're doing theirs. But so that's how I ran mine. I called it, Enviro-Guard 3 with floating set point. So I would float the set point off of the outside air temp. And then two of them we had VFDs on. And to be honest, they ran pretty damn good. it pretty much cut down the condenser cycling. We were able to maintain the target a lot tighter. So we would maintain the target and on our condenser pressure, and we were able to take the subcooling number and pretty much like flatline it in the middle of wintertime. I mean, our subcooling numbers were like flatlined. They weren't bouncing all over the place. You didn't have 20 degrees 1 minute and 30, 40 degrees the next. It was pretty much a steady flat line, and it pretty much mirrored outside air temp within like 2 to 3 degrees. So if it was 30 outside, your drop leg was like 31, 32 degrees.
So if you were floating the head, you were floating the subcooling set point as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you were doing floating head, using the approach on the condenser, and then on top of that, excuse me, you'd also be floating the subcooling. How the two? Well, maybe it's another subject, but like I'm just kind of confused how the two trying to achieve each other wasn't trying to fight each other.
Meaning the floating head or the floating TD or the floating.
Because like if it tries to achieve the pressure, you have to basically run it down. But I guess if you're floating it off the ambient, the TD is correct. Never mind.
Yes, that's how I did it. Yeah, I floated off the ambient, not the approach. So I floated off the ambient, and it kept that fight from happening.
Okay. Sorry, I just had to think it through.
Yeah, I mean it runs great like that. I mean, getting to put the VFDs on there is key. But I'll say this: Enviro-Guard's great, but you got to have that condenser clean. Like you got to actually spend time and pull these things apart and clean them, and do them from the top down, and make sure they have the right motors in there. I'll tell you this: you start putting juggernaut motors in there, and you start putting the wrong blades in there, you just like destroy Enviro-Guard. I mean, if those condensers aren't set up properly, it doesn't work right. So you want to have all that in there. And then same thing with like gas defrost. So on gas defrost Enviro-Guard racks, a lot of these, we'll go over this real quick. You may see a defrost differential valve, and you may see a liquid differential valve. So a lot of them, some of them are doing, no, you wouldn't have that. I'm thinking of the equalizer rack. So they weren't boosting the head pressure up on that. You can't do latent gas defrost in an Enviro-Guard rack. So your defrost differential valve, I mean, obviously you can only do hot gas with Enviro-Guard, so that was another issue. A lot of them you see electric. I mean, Enviro-Guard's not going to be the best for hot gas in the middle of wintertime.
I've only like what version came out in 2000? Oh my God, we're in 2022, 21, 6 years ago, 2015. 2015. What version came out then?
I would say 3.
So that one was like a Hill Phoenix Tyler version, and it had that 3. It looked like a big T. Is what it really looked like. It was painted blue, orange, and red. And basically what it would do is it was Hill Phoenix's response to cool gas. Basically, they would run hot gas through it and take a little bit of liquid coming off the surge tank, and basically use that to inject into there, and basically just trying to temper the hot gas into cool gas. So I went to someone's office in California, and they had one cut open, and I'll have to put it up. It's actually it's pretty weird how it looks inside. Have you ever seen those where you're at?
So, I've never actually seen one. I've seen pictures of it online, and people talk about it. It must be not really that common of a thing. I mean, cool gas sucks ass for defrost anyway. I tend to absolutely hate cool gas and cut it out every chance I can get. There's like an ASC almost.
Yeah, so the goes through there, comes out the top, and then basically that goes through. There's small holes. There's a small hole pointed over there. basically feeds through. So like basically the vapor, sandwiches around it, or liquid goes around it. My bad.
Okay, so let's go over the SR racks for Costco or Zero Zone. I mean, this is like microthermal and Costco / Zero Zone's baby. So these SR racks, they came out. Obviously, Zero Zone can't call it Enviro-Guard. They can't call it like floating head because Hill Phoenix would probably sue the shit out of them. It's frowned upon, stealing people's names. So what they did is a couple guys from MT and a couple guys from Zero Zone came up with this floating head to reduce the pressure. So what they're now doing is the same thing. They're using drop leg subcooling, and they are floating the head pressure, except that now their set point is 99 pounds. So they are floating 507 down to 99 pounds. And the way they're doing this is, so they have a drain valve, which would be the SPR, draining off a drop leg into a stand-up receiver. They have a pressure transducer on the top of the tank, and they are inserting discharge gas in there to keep that tank at like, I've seen it at different set points. I've seen it 55. I've seen it 85. It's usually like 10 pounds to 15 pounds lower than your head pressure setting and higher than your drop leg, or I'm sorry, your suction pressure. Now what they're doing is they're keeping that tank at a constant pressure and they're draining it off a TXV. And as your subcooling decreases, it's going to open up your TXV and it's going to push liquid out. And as the tank pressure drops, it's going to pulse the solenoid, similar to how I was doing it. And as the tank pressure rises, it's going to shut the solenoid off. And then as your subcooling increases, it's going to inject liquid into the tank. Now, their only caveat is they're not floating the set point. They leave the set point the same as it is all year round. When this becomes an issue is in the middle of summer, your head pressure is still sky high because you're increasing that subcooling over nothing. You're increasing that pressure in that condenser when you don't need to try to maintain a subcooling number. So the other caveat to this is they aren't superheating all the vapor they're bringing out the TXV. They're running it through a shell and tube heat exchanger, liquid to suction heat exchanger on the drop leg. So as the drop leg comes down, it goes through this liquid to suction heat exchanger. The TXV feeds out of there, and you set your pump out to like 15 degrees of superheat, and it's just going to pump out to the suction. So you're gaining a little bit of subcooling, not much, a couple more degrees of subcooling after the SPR valve, and you're superheating that gas, that liquid you're draining out of the bottom of the tank. Now, with this style rack, you're going to run a receiver level pretty much all year round. So you should have at least 10 to 15% in the receiver all year round. You want to maintain a level in the tank so that way when you're low on refrigerant. It's a lot easier to gauge with this style when you're low on refrigerant because you could track it. So you want to constantly be bleeding out and bleeding in, and you want to keep a level of like at least 10 to 15% in the tank.
And that's summer and winter time, right?
Yeah, that's summer or winter time. So the caveat with these were also they split the condensers. So you had split still.
I'm trying to think in what kind of rack I had, because some of the stuff you were talking about, it sounded like I had an SR, and some of the stuff you were talking about, it sounds like I have an Enviro-Guard 3.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. I mean, the SRs went on for like 5 or 6 years, maybe, and now they switched back from doing those to standard racks. So it just depends. I mean, the issue with this is with the way they were doing it microthermal, and it was kind of hard for guys to understand it. I mean, once you get into like a heavy programming, I mean, a lot of this was done with block logic. So you start getting into that and there's issues. I mean, block logic becomes difficult to troubleshoot for a lot of guys. So, I mean, you can only make something as complicated as the manpower you have working on it. If you make it too complicated, guys aren't going to be able to work on it, and it's going to be, everybody's going to hate it. So that was the issue with that version of Enviro-Guard.
And if they don't understand it, they're just going to say, "No, it doesn't work. It was the programmer. Programmer fucked it up."
Well, yeah, I mean, and then one little thing, you lose the temp sensor here. I mean, that's one thing. If you lose a transducer on an Enviro-Guard rack, you are screwed with an Enviro-Guard 3 rack. You have to change that transducer that night on the drop leg. So I've done this before. If I lost the drop leg transducer and I have a discharge one, well, I no longer have a discharge transducer. It's going to be a drop leg transducer because you cannot run without that drop leg transducer, because what's going to happen is you're going to back gas up in that line and it's not going to know what the pressure is. It's going to run your fans 100%, but now you can't dump and you're going to get random head pressure trips. So say something goes into defrost. Well, you may have had a big load go into defrost, and say you want to have suction stops with Enviro-Guard. You don't want liquid stops. You want suction stops. They generally had both, but you want the suction stop because you don't want to pump out that line. If you pump out that line, think about it. You're going to have all that refrigerant going somewhere. It's going to back up in the condenser. It's going to increase your subcooling. It's going to dump in the tank. And now it's going to have to get bled back out through a cap tube. So you're going to come out of defrost. Now you need all that line filled with refrigerant. It's not filled with refrigerant. It's pumping out of the tank still. So that's why you want to use suction stops. You don't really want to pump out circuits. And besides, circuits full of liquid defrost faster. And you're going to get that pull down faster.
Do you want to cut it here, or do you want to talk briefly on how to get an Enviro-Guard rack back up and running when it takes a dive in the wintertime?
We can go over that real quick. It'll take 5 minutes.
All right, good.
So, okay. 2 things, easiest ways to do it. So we'll go over 2 scenarios. All the gas is stuck in the condenser and all the gas is stuck in the receiver. So we'll go over all the gas stuck in the receiver first. Easiest one, common call. So you walk up to it, receivers are like 65, 70%, racks banging off, liquid line sight glasses flashing like a pig. So what you're going to do is you're going to come over to the drop leg. You're going to see why it's doing it. Make sure your sensors aren't off. Make sure your transducer isn't off. Check all that jazz real quick. So say something happened, power went out, solenoid did something. What you're going to do is you're going to go over to it. You're going to shut the drop leg ball valve. Directly after the drop leg ball valve should be another 1/2 inch or 5/8 ball valve that runs over to the front of the rack where the receiver outlet would normally be. You're going to open that valve up. Okay. You're going to watch your head. You're going to watch your drop leg pressure. What's going to happen is you're going to start pumping down the liquid line into the store. You're going to start pumping out the liquid lines in the store, and it's going to start backing up the condenser. At the same time, as soon as that pressure in that tank or inside that liquid line drops below the tank, it's going to start sucking that gas out of that tank with a 5/8 or 1/2 inch line. So, I mean, it's going to go quick. You can move a receiver from 60% to 0% in like less than 2 minutes. That is the quick way to do it. Okay. That's your easy way to do that. Now we come to the Enviro-Guard. All the gas is stuck on the roof. Condenser fan motors are stuck on or something like that. So get the condenser shut off. Same thing. Shut the drop leg ball valve. Okay. Let all that pressure pump out. Let it pump out through the store. Let it build up in the condenser. Get that condenser nice and toasty warm. Get it up like 285, 300 pounds. Get as much gas in that thing as you can, and then open that ball valve up. And then get that refrigerant moving again. That's the best way to do it. I'll tell you what, the biggest thing that makes Enviro-Guard kick ass is putting a digital compressor on or your lead compressor with a VFD. It runs so much better. I mean, all these little problems guys have go away. I mean, with a digital compressor, you're able to match the load so much better now. or a VFD, you're able to match the load so much better. It takes that Enviro-Guard from saving all that money in the energy in the wintertime with all the energy from reduced head pressure. You throw a digital compressor on there and you stop the cycling, that rack becomes like incredibly efficient. You'd be surprised. We did 2 or 3 of them up here with my floating head, and then we put digitals. I converted the 3Ds to digital 3Ds. Those racks never ran better. We had hardly any calls on them in the wintertime. Yeah, they just run great. No short cycling. I mean, no stall outs in the winter when it's super cold, when the compressors become too big. They just ran amazing.
Well, see, I was going to share mine. So, basically I had the instance where the RO board lost communication, and basically all the fans went into fail safe, and it was negative 27 outside with the wind chill. So my head pressure, I think, was 20 pounds, and my suction pressure was 5 because everything kept cycling off on low pressure. And basically I couldn't get the head pressure to rise enough to get refrigerant flowing back again. I couldn't get the head pressure back up. So I ended up having to get plastic wrap and throw it over the condenser fan motors up the top because all the heat wants to rise. And basically once I got the head pressure up to about 80 pounds, it started feeding. I had Indiana weather for a good while up in Connecticut.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. All right, guys, we'll cut it on this one. We'll do a short one on the Nature's cooling, and then the NC1 and NC2 racks on how those ones work, and a little caveat to that. And then that'll be it for Enviro-Guard.
All right, guys, have a good night.